So the 142 race laws are those laws that keep race relevant legally in South Africa. Many of them, as I said, are discriminatory. Now that would be people that are excluded from job opportunities or sports teams or any promotion because of their race.
Welcome back to the Born Free podcast. Today we're going to be having a difficult conversation, one that I think might split people in South Africa, but I think it's important that we hear everyone. It's important that we understand what's happening in our country, and it's important that we speak to everyone. As always, I'm here with Nkadimeng. How are you doing today, my brother?
I'm all right. How are you?
I'm good. And today we're joined with Ernst van Zyl from AfriForum. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
No, most definitely, most definitely. I think there's definitely been a lot that's involved AfriForum in the last couple of months. And in South Africa in particular, I think I'm very interested in, firstly, one, separating the misinformation to what you guys truly do, because I think there's a lot of misinformation that currently happens. But also, I think I want to get a deeper understanding for the things that aren't being said, for the things that people aren't necessarily hearing. So I want to start this particularly where it is at the moment. 49 refugees that have been placed in America. And the reason I want to start there is because I was reading recently, on the February 8th, you guys had said that you initially weren't going to opt for the refugee status, and then that had changed. Particularly around that specific moment, particularly around what that conversation and narrative has been. What's been the understanding and the thinking around what's been happening in the relationship with the Trump administration?
Right. So I think firstly what's important when it comes to AfriForum's stances is I'm very glad and appreciative of opportunities like this to have a long format conversation.
Yeah.
Because often the format is 5 minutes on radio, 10 minutes if you're lucky on television. You can't really condense these complex things into that small amount of time. So I'm very glad that we can have this conversation where instead of talking about a fictional version of an organization, you can actually ask a representative, what is your stance? So that's the hot news at the moment, is the Afrikaaner refugees that have went over to the United States. What's AfriForum's stance there? Well, our stance is the same as it was back when the first executive order was signed. That's the beginning of this year. And our stance is a complex one, where on the one side, we welcome the fact that Donald Trump is offering assistance to Afrikaners and that he's shining a light on the issues affecting Afrikaners. But at the same time, AfriForum is sticking to our founding mission from all the way back in 2006 when the organization was started. And that is the mission of, our mission is to create and ensure a future for Afrikaners at the southern tip of Africa. And that doesn't mean that we attack or shame people that decide to leave or to call them or that they are now no longer part of the Afrikaner community. That's a deeply personal decision that every individual makes. Yeah. So we're not taking a stance of whether people should or should not leave South Africa or should not take this offer of refugee status. But as AfriForum, we still also have to stick to our mission remains rooted in South Africa, and anything otherwise would be a opportunistic betrayal of that mission.
Yeah, I think the most beautiful thing that I've heard, particularly when it comes to Afrikaners in South Africa, but also understanding Afrikaners' connection to South Africa, is there's a very, very deep-rooted history in South Africa. I was watching the interview with Jordan Peterson and where they went through the history, and I learned quite a lot just in terms of what that history is and how much culture and how much of that is embedded currently in South Africa. And I think that always puts everyone at an interesting place, because particularly at this moment where we have heard of refugee status and we had heard of people leaving, there's a big question around where particularly do Afrikaners see themselves and what is the plan? What is the goal? What is the implementation of them existing in South Africa? Because of course, with the signing of the Bela Act, of course, the Expropriation Act, there's been a great feeling of threat and there's been a great idea of actually we're under attack. And from that standpoint, I particularly want to understand what the feeling is at the moment, because I think a lot of people understand the objective stuff, what's happening, who's going where, who's speaking to who. But from a very human perspective, what's the thing that people aren't seeing? What is the Afrikaner community actually going through and feeling that's them having to feel like they're actively under attack and there's an active problem that the South African government isn't engaging?
Well, thank you very much for taking that angle, the human angle, because I think that also gets lost within the the political space. I almost feel like, out of politeness, I want to give the same amount of eye contact to both of you as both hosts. But if I'm talking to you in one direction for 70% of the time, it's more of just out of practicality. So when it comes to particularly the human side, I think what's important to know is that one of the strongest feelings here is a feeling of a government that's been unresponsive. And I think this is where a lot of misinformation comes in. The fact that AfriForum is being accused that we are going overseas to fight our battles when we should be sorting this out in South Africa. Well, we have been trying to sort this out internally, very strongly so, for many years. And I mean, it's all on record. In the past, we've written many letters to the president, to the government, saying we want to solve this internally. We do not want to have to solve this with people, with the help of people from abroad. For example, last year with the Expropriation Act. The Expropriation Act is a piece of legislation that causes a lot of concern among particularly Afrikaners, but many people in South Africa. And at the time, last year, AfriForum wrote a letter to the president saying, we need more conversation and engagement regarding this legislation. It is not in a form currently that puts our minds at ease. We got a response saying that our letter was received, but no further response. So we said we are open for conversation, we are ready to engage, no response. Again this year, and of course this is an inconvenient factor, it's not really widely reported on, we just wrote a letter at the beginning of the year to Donald Trump, to Ramaphosa regarding Donald Trump's, his executive order and his placements or posts on social media, saying we are still open to sorting this out. There seems to be a major crisis unfolding. Let us sort this out internally. We are willing to do that. And once again, get a notice of receiving the letter from the president's office. No response, and then we went on we sent our delegation overseas. And the thinking there is, and it genuinely is an open question, and this is only two examples of many over the years, with the Bela bill the same, we wrote to the president saying we want to and need to engage. The open question is, what do you do in that situation when you've made your concerns known? You've communicated clearly to the government, you are open to engagement, you are open to solving this problem internally, but the response is a cold shoulder, no response. And then only when you go overseas saying, well, if you're not going to listen, we will talk to someone who will listen, only then does the message come through, well, no, come back, let's talk about this. I mean, that happened in 2018 as well, where again, there was a cold shoulder from the government regarding the previous process to amend the constitution to enable expropriation without compensation. Again, no response from the government regarding our letters. We go overseas, and then the president in parliament says, no, come back, let's solve this internally. So when that process repeats itself over and over again, at what point, that process of unresponsiveness, at what point do you then decide, well, I've only got two options. Either I sit back and give up and say, well, we tried, or you talk to whoever is willing to listen outside of South Africa. So that's why I'm saying it's more of an open question, even to the audience, to ponder.
Yeah, I think I want to speak particularly to this Expropriation Act, and I want to get an understanding for where the concern or where the tension is currently being built. Because from what I've read, the nil compensation seems to be the biggest thing and the biggest concern, particularly when it comes to this bill. And so I guess the question is twofold, because one, there's a massive question around recourse in South Africa and solving for the injustices which are the past. How does AfriForum particularly view that and view the idea of transformation? But I guess my second question is, particularly around this nil compensation, because the government is very, I think, pointed in its way about speaking to it, and speaking about it from a standpoint of it needs to benefit the citizens, it's the only instance in which they would justify it, and then the rest of the instances have a mediator and there's an agreed amount for the land acquisition and everything. Particularly speak to that, because I don't necessarily know if necessarily it's been conflated, where a lot of the time it's reported like AfriForum's against the Expropriation Act, where normally it tends to be potentially one or two lines that they may have an issue with. So what is the core issue when it comes to that specific bill? And how then does it necessarily impact how you guys view transformation within the country?
Sure. So let's start off with the bill itself. I mean, it's not a bill that I would just invite anyone to go read. It is a complicated one. It isn't just a TikTok video that you go listen to. But I have read the bill so many times, I know it inside and out. So in its current form, as it was signed into law, AfriForum cannot support it. And there's a part of it that particularly is concerning. It is the part regarding, as you correctly identified, the nil compensation part. No compensation, no compensation, it means the same thing. What that part particularly, what makes it concerning is twofold. So on the one side, within the bill itself, it gives the example of scenarios under which no compensation can be paid. There's about 4 or 5 examples. But the examples have a sentence at the top that leads into it, the intro sentence, which has a critical part that says, including but not limited to, which means that, and everyone is now focusing on, well, only under these circumstances. No, those are only the ones that are being mentioned, but there's an open door at the end of the sentence saying, but there are other scenarios not being named that can also result in no compensation being paid. That's a major concern. The second is the political environment and what's been said from specifically the ANC within this environment for the past few years. The first thing was the ANC attempted to amend the constitution to make expropriation without compensation possible in 2018. Yeah. They failed in that attempt, not getting enough support within parliament, but the intention was shown there. And then after that attempt failed, Ronald Lamola, then Minister of Justice, was asked by the media, well, what's going to happen next? And he said, well, this was one attempt to enable expropriation without compensation. That process has now ended. We will now use other means to enable the same ends, expropriation without compensation, which includes legislation. He's talking about the Expropriation Act, which was already in the process. Then 2022, Cyril Ramaphosa again goes on a platform, addresses ANC supporters and says, we will remain committed to enabling expropriation of property without compensation. 2023, the Deputy President, Paul Mashatile, again, talking to the media, they ask, this Expropriation Act, can you tell us a bit more? And he says, the ANC remains committed to expropriation of property without compensation. And then he's asked, but this bill talks about no compensation. Is that any difference between no and no compensation? And he says, as we understand it, it is the same thing. It's only a matter of semantics. Yeah. So, and these are just the examples off the top of my head. So if the ANC spends the past 5 years constantly saying, our mission is to enable expropriation of property without compensation, and this expropriation bill is going to be our vehicle, that doesn't really fill you with a lot of reassurance when in 2025 they say, no, actually the plan was never expropriation without compensation. It's only no compensation, these very, very isolated instances. They tone down the promises incredibly and radically. That raises a red flag for me, because 5 years in politics is nothing. What you said 5 years ago in politics remains relevant, especially if you're the president of the country or the deputy president. So, I mean, there's so many other details of the bill that I can go into that are a big concern, especially, for example, the court process that is outlined as well. We can go into that if you want. But those are the two, really the bedrock, the foundation of our concern. Do you want to talk about the court case side of it as well?
Yes, I do want to talk about the court case. But before we get into that, I guess my question here would be, is the concern at the moment that it can be executed and not necessarily that it is being executed? Because I think even in listening to what you've said now, I'm hearing almost the saying, what you're saying is, actually, no, the government's been very big on this idea of that we are going to expropriate land, and it's been a very big push for them to do so. As of this moment, they haven't necessarily done so, but what I'm hearing is that because there's been an intent to do so and that it's been spoken about in that way, there's a growing fear, and now that the bill has been signed, that fear actually means it's maximized to its capacity.
That pretty much is the summation of it. AfriForum has not claimed anywhere that the government is currently using that bill to expropriate property without compensation, but it has granted itself that power, and that's worrying, especially when it has, over the past 5 years, promised that it will use that power. That's the concern.
Okay, that makes sense. And then going on to your second concern regarding the court cases, let's work into that. So what's that about?
That's the other, in fat quotation marks, reassuring line that you hear from the government side, saying, well, no, the courts will decide. There's just one major issue, well, many major issues, but there's a certain very major issue with that, and that's the fact that a court battle takes many, many years. And the bill states explicitly, while that court battle is going on, you are deprived of your property that has been expropriated until the court case is concluded. Now, firstly, when is the first court date? If your court case starts in if the court papers are filed in 2025, when will your first court appearance be? Well, at the moment, last time I checked, it will be 2028 in the High Court. That's the start of your court case. Your court case starts, whether you win or lose that court case, then it will go to the appeals court. No matter which side wins, the other side will take it to the Supreme Court of Appeal. That's going to be firstly, the first phase of the court case is going to take years. Second phase now goes to the Supreme Court of Appeal. That's more years being put on, added to it. Whatever happens there, whatever party loses is going to take it to the Constitutional Court. That's more years. At the end, you're looking, when you look very optimistically, you're looking at a 5 to 8 year court battle. If you're looking realistically, a bit more cynically, that's 10 to 12 to 15 years that you're going to be fighting. And all this time, as the bill stipulates, you are deprived of your property. And if you're a farmer, you're deprived of your only income source. So that's once again not a reassurance. It's once again, it sounds, if you just take the political sloganeering on its face value, it sounds reassuring, well, the courts will decide. But then when you go into the details, you realize, but there's actually a lot more concerning stuff here below, under the hood of the car.
And I guess the question then from there is, there'll be many South Africans who listen to this who will ask the question around transformation. Because if you read about land ownership in South Africa, 3/4 are owned by the white population and only 1/4 is owned by the black population, particularly when it comes to farmland in South Africa. And I guess what I'm not hearing is an opposition to transformation in any capacity, because there's not an issue with the entire bill from what I'm understanding. But I do ask the question, to many South Africans who do say this is the form of transformation, to the ANC who's also called it out and said that this is our way of transforming the country, this is our way of dealing with redress, what is the response to that? Because I guess there has to be a question around how do we both balance the history and the community that's deeply tied to South Africa, because there's no ways of making South Africa without its black population, and there's no ways of making South Africa without its Afrikaans population. So there's also this very high tension that's also happening between populations, between groups, and how people are viewing it, which is why everyone's deduced this very quickly to a race thing or a community thing. And I don't necessarily think it to be that. There's black farmers, there's white farmers, they exist en masse. So particularly to that, what then is the response to transformation, or how do you guys believe transformation should be taking place from your point of view?
Well, that question is the third act of the movie. So this conversation we've been having now inevitably then ends with the final question of, well, what's your response then? What is your alternative? Well, the alternative is, and AfriForum took part in the entire parliamentary process of public comment when this bill was still being considered before it was signed into law. So there's, maybe for some of your viewers that don't know, there's with any bill, there's a comment process open for the public where you can put written comments or oral comments voicing your opposition or support for a bill and pointing out what is concerning to you or what you like about the bill. AfriForum took part in all of this, every opportunity we got. And what we put forward there specifically is the answer to this question, well, what is your alternative? Well, the alternative is to fix the land restitution process that's already in place, that has been in place since the late 90s, early 2000s. Can't remember the exact date, but it's in that ballpark. And that restitution process is built on the principle that if you were dispossessed by the previous regime and you have proof of that dispossession, the government gets your land back, and you then have two options. You can either get that physical piece of land back if you are successful in your land claim, or you can get the cash value of that land back. More than 90% of those land claimants, according to the government of land, the Department of Land Reform, took cash rather than the land itself. I think is a critical fact. And then also, there's another part of it, and that this process has been, unfortunately, this restitution process that has been in place has unfortunately been derailed by corruption, mismanagement, people getting land for dubious reasons with no connection to that land, people with always coincidentally with the right political connections. It's a story that you've heard, that you've seen play out so many times. It's not unique to South Africa. But that's unfortunately, it has derailed that restitution process. And that's a restitution process that AfriForum doesn't have a problem with, because it's built on the principle of, if there is a legit land claim, the government doesn't just go take that land and whoever owns it at that time is thrown off. They are paid fair and adequate compensation, and then that land is either given back to the successful land claimant or they get the cash value of it immediately. The other problem with that process is, even those that have gotten their land back through that process successfully and who have opted to get that land specifically, have gotten no support from the government in regards to, anyone who even knows a little bit of farming knows it's not just putting seeds in the ground. It is machines. It is fertilizer. It is a business that you're running. It is accounting. It is this very complex process that needs a lot of support and a very strong foundation to be built on. And that foundation takes the form of investment, of assets, of everything you need to run a successful farm. The government promised a lot of people that support, but unfortunately, from what we can see, a lot of people, what they testify, they're not getting that support. They're getting minimal at best in regards to their wish to farm that land that they've successfully claimed back. So it's a two-pronged issue that you have. On the one side, the land restitution process has been derailed by corruption and cronyism. But on the other side, where it has been successful, often those people that get the land back don't get the support that they were promised. And then that person is put in a very difficult situation. You can sit on that piece of land that you don't have the resources to do anything with, or the resources that you thought you were going to get, that you were promised, or you can just sell it. And then I think a lot of those people think, well, maybe I should have just taken the cash, as 90% of people do, because there's just so many stories of empty promises of people, of the government saying, well, we will help you get your farm started, and then nothing happens.
I think a core tension that definitely develops itself in South Africa, and I even saw this while watching the video with Jordan Peterson, was this idea of there being hunter-gatherer communities in South Africa. And they're not necessarily being title deeds, land ownership in the exact same way that we consider it in the 21st century. And I think one of the most interesting tensions is, what do you say to communities who technically, and I say very technically, because being on the land and owning the land is a bit, I think there's a very interesting tension there. But technically claim that, no, we have the land, or we were on the land first, therefore we have a claim to it. Because I think the most interesting thing that I found was this idea of, there was places in South Africa that were just land, that actually didn't have populations, that were occupied.
Especially when you take into account South Africa is the size of a continent. If you... a little bit of homework for your audience, go Google just South Africa overlay over Europe, a map. It covers the majority of Europe. South Africa is a massive place. I think a lot of people outside South Africa can't comprehend how large South Africa is.
And so from that standpoint, I think, how do you then balance both that cultural context and that context that is the South African history that says, prior to the establishment and prior to the arrival of the Dutch in South Africa, there wasn't title deeds, there wasn't land ownership. And then everything that happens in our history means that people were moved off their land, people were put in secluded areas. And now we've got South Africans who say, technically I have a claim to that land because of the tribe that I'm a part of, or because of the family that I'm a part of. But proving that that land was ever mine or was ever in my family is significantly harder. Because I think that then always creates the ability for people to go, but no, we were the ones to set up the first title deed. And of course, that's where the courts step in, and that's kind of where they mediate those processes. But from that standpoint, there's still a wealth of South Africans who would say, but no, technically my family knows this is our native land, this is where we came from, this is where our roots lie to.
I understand, yes. So that's where it gets very complex, because how do you build a restitution process based on something, as you described, that you can't really legally prove? Well, the only way that I can think how you solve that problem is that you create the opportunity for those who want to farm to have the opportunity to start building that future with the accessibility to farmland. Now, the government can do that. The government owns 17 million hectares of land, a lot of that farmland, and it can create that opportunity for people. It chooses not to. Now, you can speculate why they are holding on to it rather than giving it to people. That's a very big number. 17 million hectares, even I'd struggle to see it in my mind's eye. It's the size of 2 provinces. It's the size of Mpumalanga and KwaZulu-Natal. So that's what the government owns, land. So I would think the only just way to solve that problem that you're describing there, without abusing anyone's human rights, would be to give those, because not all South Africans want to farm, but those that want to farm, that want a piece of land where they can farm as their ancestors did, is to give them the opportunity to create a realistic path towards starting a farm. What's the word? My English, accessibility to land. But that's not impossible for the guy that doesn't have millions to invest, someone that wants to start small scale and expand. And the government can do that. The government has that land at its disposal to give people that opportunity. It chooses not to. There's a whole speculative conversation on why it doesn't, but it is there. And I think that's the way to go forward. Another thing to also take into account, unfortunately, even though South Africa is that big, a large part of it looks like the surface of Mars. If you've ever driven through the Northern Cape, or just go on Google Earth and go look at the Northern Cape province, even large parts of the Free State and the Western Cape, there's nothing there. There's not even little towns there. It's just dead. And the farmers there have farms the size of countries, because you need a farm the size of a country to keep 10 sheep alive, because there's nothing growing there. I don't know any South African that wants to go farm there. So again, it's a large part of the story is the fact that large parts of South Africa are incredibly difficult to farm in, and it's not most people's desire to go live there in the middle of nowhere and farm with 10 sheep. So that's another aspect. So just to bring it back, the question of what's the way forward? Well, even though the vast majority of South Africans do not want to go farm, I don't want to go farm. That doesn't mean that those that want to go farm, that think they have the minerals inside them to be able to make it work, shouldn't then be given the opportunity through a realistic pathway for them. And I think the government can give them that pathway if they just find it in themselves to let go of some of the prime farmland that it has in its possession.
I want to kick gears with this conversation a little bit and change to the conversation that's been happening, not just on social media, but has been happening with discourse with the United States government around alleged human rights atrocities that are happening in South Africa. Now, part of the conversation that's been happening is a number of 142 race-based laws that have been legalized in the South African context that are prejudicial to the white community in South Africa. I don't want to say the Afrikaaner community, because you're talking about a very diverse...
are one cultural group within a racial minority.
Literally, the diversity, I recognize at a certain point, it's a mix of Dutch, French, and a little bit of Anglo blood there.
To interrupt there. It's just so fascinating to me. Whenever outsiders talk about South Africa, it is a black and white story. But even within the black population group and the white population group, there's all of these different cultural and linguistic lines, and if you don't take that into account, South Africa is not going to make sense to you. I know it has nothing to do with your question. It's a fascinating part of the conversation that I think it's almost always overlooked.
It's always overlooked, but I really want to kick into that conversation to understand firstly, I've tried to search for the list of this 142 laws. The only one that I could find was released by the Institute of Race Relations. And the majority of those laws obviously predate 94. And when you look at them in context, most of them have been repealed. So I want to get an understanding, what is this conversation around the prejudicial laws? Yes. What are the alleged human rights atrocities that are happening in South Africa? Because for the people listening at home, they're like, we don't see this conversation that's happening. We don't understand what Trump is tweeting about. And to them, if they're not seeing it in the country, but it seems that on their side, I was at ENC with Kali Kriel for the Sona Watch Party, and he mentioned that this was a huge point of contention that they raised whilst they were that side. They want to know, okay, so then what is this exactly that is being raised? What is it that we're not seeing, but that you guys are seeing?
Right. So there's also a huge conversation to be had. I'll see how much we can fit in. But I think there's two main sides to that story. The one side is the farm murder and rural security side, which we can get into. And
which isn't just white people.
No, it's not. And then there's also the race laws side. So you started with the race laws question, so let's deal with that, and then we can get to what else also is relevant. So those 142 race laws, the race laws index that you referenced is the list. Now, just because a law doesn't have a name like the racial oppression law doesn't mean that it doesn't have a racial element. How that index, I'm not the creator of the index, but I've studied the index. You should actually have Martin van Zyl, the creator of the index, on, a fascinating guy. How he set up the index is a race law is any law that makes race legally relevant. So it makes your race legally or to the law relevant. And many of those laws, or the laws that are mentioned there under the race laws index, are laws that mention, for example, that there needs to be racial redress, but racial redress in the sense of, well, some people are going to be, in quotes, positively discriminated against to create redress. An example of that would be the Employment Equity Act or the Broad Black Economic Empowerment Act, or the Competition Act is another example that explicitly brings in race into the conversation to create, it makes race relevant to producing certain outcomes through discrimination. Now, the major conversation is around, well, whether that is positive or negative discrimination. That seems to be the major debate. But whether these laws make race relevant legally is a fact. It's in the laws themselves. So the 142 race laws are those laws that keep race relevant legally in South Africa. Many of them, as I said, are discriminatory. Now, that would be people that are excluded from job opportunities or sports teams or any promotion because of their race. And we saw many examples of this even recently. So one of the most prominent examples from recent memory would be Dis-Chem, when there was an internal memo that was leaked in 2018 where the CEO said, well, we are going to have to put a moratorium, a freeze on any hiring or promotion of white people because we are being threatened with major fines by the government if we don't reach these certain racial targets. That's explicit racial exclusion and discrimination. Now, you can take the angle of whether that's positive or negative. That's a debate that you can have, but whether it's racial discrimination or not, that's really not a debate. Then there's the example of sport. This year, there was a professional cricket team, the Warriors, that were kicked out of a tournament because they did not reach the right race quota in their team. Not just kicked out of the tournament, they were fined for that. So, and then there's many other examples as well. The Tourism Relief Fund in 2020 during COVID, where small family businesses could qualify in the tourism sector, could qualify for relief, but only if their management wasn't too white, if their management fulfilled certain race criteria. The reason why South Africa doesn't have Starlink, another example of racial criteria keeping a company out of South Africa. Now you can say, well, the intention of that legislation keeping Starlink out of South Africa is to give 30% stake for South Africans in a foreign company, but it has a racial element. It's 30% previously disadvantaged, so it obviously excludes white South Africans from that. And the problem then comes in, well, on the one side, you have these discriminatory legislation, but on the other side, there's the debates of whether, the debate is, one side is saying, oh, it's not happening, it doesn't exist. And the other side, another group is saying, well, it does exist, but it's a good thing. Now, I think there's still a debate on that side. There's a debate to be had. It exists, but it's a good thing. On whether it exists or not, I don't think really is a debate. These laws exist. You can't really deny them. The Black Economic Empowerment Act does exist. The Employment Equity Act does exist. The Competition Act does exist. The Public Procurement Act does exist. And I think that's where the problem comes in, is that we genuinely have people in the comment sphere that say, no, none of these exist. Well, then you're just openly denying what's going on. From what's AfriForum's stance on this, maybe to conclude, AfriForum's stance is racial discrimination by the government is in principle wrong, whether it be in the past or the present. You don't correct racial discrimination in the past with racial discrimination in the present. You fix the problems of South Africa, like major unemployment and poverty and many other societal problems, through growing the economy, growing the cake, rather than fighting over the distribution of ownership of a shrinking cake or pie, whatever metaphor you want to use. So that's the conversation that's going on. There's as I said, it's or you intro this whole conversation that this is an uncomfortable one, that it is one that gets controversial, that gets people very emotional, rightly so.
Yeah.
But I'm just glad we can have that conversation. I'm glad that it's not a conversation built on a foundation of just denialism. None of this is happening. We don't even have to talk about it.
Yeah.
But rather built on a foundation of there's a debate to be had, but whether there's a debate to be had or not, I mean, that's what we're doing here right now.
And the human rights.
Well, racial discrimination by the government, I think, is a human rights abuse.
Yeah.
To put it simply.
But a lot of the allegations that were made is that there is a systematic underreporting, a deliberate underreporting from the South African police services when it comes to instances of farm attacks, specifically when it is related to white farmers.
Right.
This was an allegation.
Yeah, that's the other side of the conversation that I said earlier is there's the race laws side and then there's the farm murders side. So on the farm murders side, I mean, there's a lot of issues. On the first thing is you have very prominent politicians with millions of followers chanting, kill the Boer, kill the farmer, encouraging farm murders. I mean, I can't really see any other way of seeing it. Secondly, you have a government that refuses to classify farm murders as a priority crime. Now, here's a very important distinction. The layman out there hears priority crime and thinks, oh, it should be the priority of the police. No, priority crimes are a specific category of crime that the police gives special attention to in regards to it has a special investigation unit, it has a special counter strategy. Examples of priority crimes include rhino poaching, gender-based violence, gang violence, cash and transit heists, political assassinations. These are all priority crimes. AfriForum's stance is that farm murders are of a nature that they qualify to also be a priority, to fit that list, that categorization. The government refuses. Then it's also, unfortunately, a violent crime phenomenon that the president openly denies. Now, this is not a conspiracy theory. In 2018, you can go look it up, President Ramaphosa goes to New York and says there are no murdering of farmers in South Africa. That's an open denial. That's not, there's a debate to be had on the severity of the issue, but there's not a debate to be had on whether the issue exists. The president's stance is the issue doesn't exist. He's never retracted that comment or apologized for it. That's concerning. And then on the other side is Chants that encourage this violent crime phenomenon. The president refuses to condemn it. AfriForum wrote a letter to the president after Human Rights Day when Julius Malema did the chant. We wrote a letter to the president and said, you need to condemn this chant, that it has no place in our society. The president's spokesperson responded by saying the president will not. Now, it almost comes full circle back to where the conversation started, to an unresponsive, cold government, where a minority group says, these are our concerns, these are the things that are issues that affect us and things that make us feel unwelcome, excluded, or in danger, or under threat. And rather than engage with that group, the response is, we're not going to do anything, these are all overblown, these issues are illegitimate. You even talking about these issues is treasonous, as some ANC officials have said. That's where it gets very concerning. But I mean, that's in a nutshell the farm murder side of it as well. And I think, unfortunately, when it comes to this conversation regarding the very bad things happening in South Africa, pointing out the issues that affect your community or affect you personally. I mean, I've had loved ones affected by farm attacks. I've had to console a loved one over the phone during a farm attack. Then having that experience and then being told your concerns or these issues that affect you deeply are a conspiracy theory, I think people need to put themselves in that position and ask, how would you feel if that was you? If you have an issue that deeply affects you and being told, but the issue that has affected you and that you care very deeply about is misinformation.
Well, the argument from the government side is that they do recognize that these attacks do happen, but that these attacks do not happen as specifically framed as a specific attack on farms, but happens as a larger trend on crime in the country. Because I remember the then Minister Bela making the statement, or rather making the presentation in Parliament, that these crimes, though they do exist, are no different from the common occurrences of hijackings, people breaking into your homes. It's just that the majority of these happen in rural areas, small plots, small claims,
rural plots,
rural plots, and obviously your generalized farms. But as far as SAPS goes, on their tracking side, there's a reason why maybe from one quarter it would be reported, but then it would end up in the annual statistics at the end. It's because so little occur in such a targeted fashion that it doesn't, from them at least, constitute something like perhaps a burning of a synagogue.
I've heard that response from the government and apologists many times, but it doesn't make sense to me. It's, as I said, it's the only violent crime phenomenon that's encouraged by high-profile politicians, and the president refuses to condemn those that encourage it through chants like kill the Boer, kill the farmer. It's a violent crime phenomenon that if you swap out the profession for any other profession, it becomes horrific. Last year, there were plus minus 50 farm murders, but what if it was 50 doctors, 50 journalists, 50 podcast hosts, 50 politicians? Suddenly it becomes a lot more serious in your mind.
Just to add there, I think, just to give a bit of perspective as well, I think even how we think about the 14 soldiers from the DRC, like it's a very small number, but it was still considered a very key issue.
Right. And for example, I always use the example of gender-based violence. The vast majority of murder victims are men, but it doesn't mean that delegitimizes the cause to bring attention to gender-based violence. But for some reason, people argue because farm murders are a small percentage of the total amount of murders that delegitimizes the cause to bring attention to it. So I've heard that justification that it is just normal crime, but it doesn't fit the bill for me, especially also if you take into account the high levels of torture that you see accompanied with many of these cases. Many of these cases where murder is committed and nothing is stolen. Only thing that's stolen is the vehicle to be used as a getaway car and then it's dumped next to the road. There's just too many things that make it abnormal, and it's been well documented.
Yeah, I think I want to separate two things here, because I think there is what's actually happening on the ground and there's the political messaging.
Right.
Because I think...
As with most issues.
Yeah, as with most issues in South Africa. And it was a brilliant point made about if you had just replaced the word farmer with any other race, any other community, everyone would have a problem with it. And I think it's that interesting thing about where South Africa is in trying to deal with its history and deal with the anger that's brought upon its history, but also trying to deal with what's happening currently. And particularly to this thing around high-level politicians. So I think I've been reading around this case, and I think it's been relatively interesting because the Supreme Court in South Africa didn't necessarily vote in favor and they refused to take an appeal. Fikile Mbalula came out recently to say that he doesn't see the need to be chanting such anymore. He understands that it was rooted in the struggle and it was a struggle anthem at the time, but there's not necessarily the context and the elements that should utilize or call for anyone to ever do that. But I think more than that, what's the most interesting is that a lot of people have said it's been performative. It has been used as a means of getting attention, riling people up and getting the responses. And particularly around that chant, but particularly around how it's been engaged with South Africa, because I think this will potentially give me a bit more insight. Is that then the government not necessarily responding and the judicial courts not necessarily prioritizing and protecting Afrikaans communities, in particular, farmer communities in particular? And is that where a lot of the concern comes from? Because I think what everyone wants to understand is what leads to what's quote-unquote seen as the extreme, going to a Donald Trump administration, speaking to people in Europe? Because as you've identified correctly, there has been a lack of a response or little to no response by the South African government. But is it those particular things that push you guys over the edge? And in those being pushed over the edge, I guess the second question I would ask there is, the response hasn't necessarily been the best. And I think this is where I think it's been very difficult to navigate this issue from a South African standpoint. Donald Trump recently came out and claimed that there was a white genocide happening in South Africa. And I think when the word genocide is used, people tend to think of the vast bad instances in history where we've spoken about.
Rwandan genocide.
Yes, you think Rwanda, you think the Holocaust. You could even consider what's happening now between Israel and Palestine. And all of those instances, those are individuals going through a great deal of threat, who are losing their lives. And that's no different to what's happening here in South Africa. But particularly when you see a response go from we should be dealing with these issues locally to then such an extreme response from an administration, how do you particularly engage with that as AfriForum? Because I think what was the most interesting was when they were speaking about AGOA, and particularly our AfriForum wants to ensure that AGOA is something that's still implemented so business can take place, and it particularly benefits farmers within the citrus industry and other spaces, that there's still a deep investment in South Africa. It's not to say that we want to do away with the country. It's not to say that we want to go and we want to necessarily up and leave. There's still a strong investment and a strong tie. But when you see those conversations where you've gone to a Trump administration and the response is very, very strong, and now AGOA is being put into question, what do you make of all that's happened, and what do you make of what the messaging has been in this conversation?
I think AGOA is the perfect example, almost in microcosm, to answer your question. So AGOA, the trade agreement, for maybe people in the audience that don't know, gives you a tariff-free trade for farmers, but other industries benefit from it as well. In South Africa, it is a bill or a agreement with wide-ranging positive outcomes for the majority of South Africans. When it comes to the messaging on that bill, because now it is under threat, it's not under threat because AfriForum raised awareness about what's happening in South Africa. It is under threat because it has specific criteria that the government is not meeting. So it has many criteria, but I'll give the main ones. And your audience can even follow along and ask themselves, is the government meeting these criteria? These criteria weren't decided last year. They were decided many years ago when this when this agreement was signed. The first one is, your government needs to protect private property rights and not threaten private property rights. Secondly, the government must keep, must keep interference in the economy, or state interference in the economy, to a minimum. The government must not give verbal or financial support to international terrorist organizations or governments that fund terrorism. The government must have robust systems in place for fighting and preventing corruption. And the government must, if the government does not have any of these criteria, it needs to be actively moving to establish them.
Yeah.
These are some of the main criteria of the AGOA agreement. I'm going to go out on a limb and say we are not meeting any of those criteria at the moment. That's not AfriForum's fault. That's a government that doesn't seem to understand when it signs an agreement you have to stick to the criteria, and if you don't meet one of those criteria, you can be kicked out. That's not even talking about not meeting any of it. So, but AfriForum still, with that in mind, we went to the United States, our delegation, we gave a memorandum directly to senior officials within the Trump administration, and one of the key points, well, 2 key points on that memorandum, and this is directly communicating to the Trump administration, was one, yes, we know South Africa is not meeting this criteria of this agreement, but it is so beneficial to the country and its people that we ask that we not be kicked out of the agreement, and that a deal is made that it is kept in place. Secondly, that if punishment is enacted, if sanctions are a route that the Trump administration takes, those sanctions should not be targeted towards the country of South Africa. Those sanctions should be targeted towards those politicians that are inciting violence against minorities and those that are pushing legislation that aims to violate people's rights, like their constitutional right to private property. That's our message. It's not you have to go listen to private leaked recordings to know that's what we said. It's open, out in the open. You can go find it. You can read exactly verbatim what we handed over to the Trump administration on our website. The Washington Memorandum is what it's called. So to answer your question, in microcosm, I think AGOA is the best example of AfriForum can state our case, but how the US and the Trump administration decides to respond to the policies and the rhetoric and the actions of the South African government, we can only give them we can state a case and make an argument on what should be done, but we don't. Donald Trump is not our puppet. We don't even have Donald Trump on WhatsApp. We can't tell him this is a bad idea, don't do this. This is a good idea, do this. At the end of the day, how the US responds to the actions and the policies and the rhetoric of the government of South Africa, whether that be the ANC government previously or the GNU today, is up to the discretion and the judgment of the Trump administration or whatever his advisors tell him in regards to Africa. That's the reality. And I don't think there's any organization in South Africa that can influence Donald Trump in regards to how he, at the end of the day, decides how he's going to act. And that's the situation where we find ourselves in. I don't think And I mean, I don't think it's far out to call it a diplomatic crisis that we find ourselves in. I don't know whether this will have happened by the time this episode is published, but the president of South Africa is set to meet Donald Trump now soon, within the next week. I hope it's a transparent meeting, like with some of his other meetings in the past with, like, for example, Zelensky or Bukele from El Salvador, where they're sitting where you can actually listen in. On a side note, that's a fantastic development. I think these types of meetings between world leaders that's the format you need to go with, not hearing third or fourth sources telling you this is what was said. Really, no, you as the audience or you as a public citizen of the countries that are going to be affected can actually listen to what's being said. I think that's a fantastic format. So I hope that the conversation between Donald Trump and Ramaphosa takes the same format, because I think it will be a benefit and an eye-opener, not just to Americans, but to South Africans that are genuinely interested in what's going to be said. And maybe it's a tough conversation, maybe not. I'm very curious.
Yeah, I think the question I want to ask in closing, and apologies to kind of put two things together here. So firstly, one, in South Africa, when you look at just management level of the private sector, right? 2/3 of it are white owned, 13%, 14% is black owned, and then the rest is the other demographics that exist in South Africa. So the Employment Equity Act is particularly a very interesting one, because it's a shift from BEE to now the government having the capacity to set targets for specific companies, or then as a result not necessarily allowing the government to engage with those companies if they don't necessarily reach those targets. But I think why I say that to that is to say that there's been recent reporting about the ANC having met with top Afrikaans leadership recently. And I'm curious as to what that conversation is particularly geared to, and what the conversation is going forward between both AfriForum and the current government, but particularly AfriForum and the ANC, because that seems to be the strongest tension point at the moment. Because I guess on one end, what we're hearing is a government that's not backing down. We're hearing a government that's saying we're going to stand on our policies, we're going to act as we are.
That's the essence of we will not be bullied. If you're going to use language like that, that is an uncompromising stance. Yes.
Correct. So there's the essence of that. And then there's also within that messaging a very strong push from the ANC to say that this is our own sovereign country. We should be able to dictate the laws. No international entity should be able to influence what happens in our country, and we should be able to run as a sovereign nation. And I think particularly around that conversation, and particularly for the conversations going forward, what is the expectation from your guys' side to get out of those conversations? But also then, what is the expectation for the transformation that the ANC has pushed forward? Because I do recognize a great deal of this is because of the ANC in terms of where the economy is, in terms of where the country is. But the ANC still very much says transformation still has to occur. Of course, I think there's different alternatives and different means to getting to that transformation. But we have what we have now, and I don't necessarily know if it's likely to change, or there hasn't been reports to say it would change. So from that standpoint, when you're having these conversations, when you guys are engaging, what is it to say that South Africans are meant to potentially take out of this, and what are you guys trying to necessarily get out of it?
I wish I was part of those senior conversations to give you the inside scoop, but I've got a good idea of what probably was said. So I think at the end of the day, it comes down to, as I said earlier, that principle of, well, from AfriForum and the Solidarity Movement side, we cannot be in support of any racially discriminatory policies by the government. But we're also not just criticizing to criticize, we also have the alternative. And the alternative is to create a business-friendly environment where it's easy to start a business, where it's easy to find employment, but not just find employment. I always use from my own experience. I didn't go to a fancy school. I just went to a normal public school in the South African countryside. And so I've experienced the South African school system. And the South African school system, maybe it's been a while since I've been in school, so maybe it's changed. But my experience of school was you are taught to be a job seeker, not to be a job creator. My entire school experience was, here's how you are an effective job seeker. And I don't think that's the right approach to creating an environment where you're fighting a unemployment rate that just went up the other day again. The only way to really solve that is to create an environment where, firstly, your education system is orientated towards creating job creators, not just job seekers. And secondly, growing that pie, growing the economy, creating opportunities for people. I always ask the question, why are all the major companies in South Africa like almost 100 years old or more than 100 years old? Where are the new major companies that started in the 21st century or in the past 30 years. Capitec is one example, but where are the others? I mean, Sanlam is almost 100 years old. ABSA's predecessor is also almost 100 years old. Avbob is almost 100 years old. All these major companies and businesses and corporations are very, very old, and they were created many decades ago. Where are these new generation of businesses, the job creators of the future that are going to grow the economy? Where they're going to come from? You can only... The debate regarding how do we redistribute the proportions owned of this shrinking cake, that debate can only go so far. At some point, you're going to have to create more opportunities. In the extreme, if you were to take all the jobs of every white South African in existence and give them to black South Africans, it would only put a tiny little small dent in the unemployment rate. That's the situation that we find ourselves in. That's not sustainable. We have to find a solution where more opportunities are created rather than just rearranging chairs on the Titanic. You actually have to grow the ship, and it has to go into the right direction. It has to stop sinking.
Yeah. I want to say thank you very much for giving us your time, but also thank you for having this conversation with us.
Well, thank you for the opportunity again for detailed conversations
Most
where you can
definitely.
actually get into the meat of something. I'm not a big believer in sound bites and sloganeering. I like these types of conversations. And as we've seen now in our time, the people out there have an attention span to be able to listen to an hour conversation if it's on a topic that they're interested in or curious in. So thank you very much for the platform.
Yes, thank you very much. And to everyone else there, we're going to have more conversations. We're going to keep discussing this issue. We're going to unpack. We're going to hear from different voices. And as always, this is Born Free.